It's a privilege to be here with this panel. I'd like to start by saying that we're 3.5 years into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's objectives to subjugate Ukraine remain the same, but Russia's ability to do so remains limited. And Ukraine's battlespace innovation has contributed greatly to the widening gap between Russia's goals and Russia's means. We've observed the transformation of Ukraine's defense innovation from its early MacGyvering phase with volunteers building drones in their garages to now Ukraine turning its single-digit production capacity into estimated $30 billion annual production capacity. General Petraeus, sir, we've traveled to Ukraine together 6 times in the last 3 years and observed the transformation of Ukraine's defense innovation ecosystem firsthand. What are the big ideas that the US national security community should be taken away from Ukraine? And equally importantly, which lessons are not applicable?
Well, the biggest of the big ideas, again, is that the future of war, at least in a circumstance like that in Ukraine, which does include maritime domain as well as air and ground, the future of war is increasingly one that doesn't have humans on the front lines. It has unmanned systems. Right now, they are generally remotely piloted, but over time, they're going to become algorithmically piloted. When you get to the swarm stage, you just can't have enough pilots for all of that. And that's what we need to be preparing for much more rapidly than we are at the present time. There's also a component of this that has to do not just with, again, defense on the ground that we often think about, where the Ukrainians have so really brilliantly largely kept the Russians in check. Certainly there are incremental gains on a daily basis at extraordinary cost to the Russians. Again, 1.1 million killed and wounded at this point and climbing rapidly. There is also, though, an air and ballistic missile defense component here, and that the clip that we just saw, I think, underscored how important it is to make progress in that. And that's the area where we have some comparative advantage certainly over Ukraine. They're dependent on the ballistic missile early warning and defense systems that we and others have provided them, and the interceptors and so forth. It's not enough for them. We've seen the importance of this, obviously, also in the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, and noting, as I think I said yesterday, that over 5% of the missiles actually got through in Israel. And Israel's a tiny little postage stamp of a country to defend relative to, say, Ukraine or more so the continental United States. But the area of counter-drone warfare that has now seized the attention of those really throughout Europe. Again, it's not just the Eastern European countries and the Baltic states that are concerned about this. It's more broadly. You saw that, again, airports were shut down in Denmark and Germany, as well as other locations further to the east. That's a particularly difficult subject. And even Ukraine here is still struggling in the action, counteraction, and so forth. You know, we've been out on the streets of Ukraine at night at various times, and you didn't even worry about you could literally hear the Shahed drones up there, but you knew that it's a modest little amount of explosive. The defenses are generally going to get it. Now the Shahed has evolved in Russian factories into a jet engine, flying much higher, much faster, and with a much bigger payload, and they can actually do real damage now. And the fact that Ukraine can only shoot down 80-ish%, which is pretty impressive, but they're still doing enormous damage on a nightly basis, as is the case of Ukraine going to Russia. That is another whole dimension where there's got to be rapid improvement, and we're not remotely doing what we should do in that area. We have some very impressive point defense niche startups in the high-power microwave and laser realm, but we're talking about how do you defend against very large numbers, increasingly large numbers that you see that are actually manned, or unmanned, remotely piloted. What do we do when the swarms start? So all of these different challenges we see on the battlefield in Ukraine, and as we've all, I think, agreed over the last couple of days, we're not responding rapidly enough to that in the United States. And even the country that is responding so rapidly, in which those who design, manufacture, and employ unmanned systems, Ukraine, even they are struggling to keep up with the evolution on the other side. People should not take that only Ukraine is evolving. The Russians are evolving very rapidly as well. So we have to learn much more quickly what we need to do. We should have the concepts from this. Certainly you apply them to the different theaters in which we might actually have to fight, the Indo-Pacific being foremost among those. But we're certainly not doing that at all as rapidly as we should right now. Again, keep in mind, we're manufacturing maybe 300, 400,000 drones in the United States. The Ukrainians alone are manufacturing 3.5 million, and if they get the additional money from the EU, they could double that production very easily. So that's what's going on the battlefield, and it's what's not going on in our defense industrial base, in our procurement system, and even to a degree in our conceptual domain. And keep in mind, it's the concept that should drive all of this, the concept of war in the future. And there's notions out there, but I haven't seen hard and fast concepts, much less actual doctrinal manuals on the future of warfare.
Thank you. And I do want to come back to the question of air defense, but first, when it comes to Joy, you had a very impressive career in U.S. Special Operations, and in the last year, you've been really focused on building the collaboration between Ukraine's and U.S. defense industrial ecosystem. Could you talk to us a little bit about, first of all, how U.S. companies have done in Ukraine so far, and what specifically the U.S. defense industrial base need to change and how it needs to adapt for this challenge?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. First off, the Ukrainians are not huge fans of a lot of U.S. companies inside of Ukraine for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that the innovation cycle inside of Ukraine is very fast. We've all heard that. But to put that in perspective, if you were to think about mom and the kids sitting around the kitchen table at night building drones, and dad's out shooting the drones, and he calls back at the end of the day and provides feedback on how those drones performed in combat, and then mom and the kids are making improvements to the drones. It's something like that, right? That's kind of how it started. Drone factories cropped up in every garage, across Ukraine once people started realizing the utility of drones and how important they would be. So that innovation cycle is literally hours, days, weeks at worst. If something doesn't perform, immediate improvements are made, and new systems are fielded within days or weeks. In the United States, we have sort of a layer of insulation between the innovation cycle and the actual user. So if you think of it like a cake, in Ukraine there's two layers. There's the end user, and there's the engineers that are making technological improvements. In the United States, we have a third layer in there, and that's the procurement cycle. So that's the federal acquisition regulations, the contracting cycle, all these different things. And so if I was to go to, if Lockheed Martin was to make me, not to pick on Lockheed Martin, but if any defense technology company was to make me a piece of equipment, and it went through the procurement cycle and it came down, and me as the end user use that in the battlefield, and then I provide feedback. I say, well, it doesn't quite work the way I wanted it to. I provide feedback. It goes through the contracting cycle, and they modify the contract, and it goes back to the manufacturer. And 3 to 6 months later, after they've modified the contract and they've paid the technologist more money to modify the technology, it comes back to me, right? And it's at that point, it's what I needed 6 months ago. It's not what I need right now. Whereas in Ukraine, what they're getting is what we needed, a week ago or an hour ago or 2 days ago. So I'm not saying that we need to get rid of that insulative layer. There's goodness there, but I think we just need to relook how that works and how it functions and how it feeds the warfighter. We need to have innovation as a rule, and not as a contracting mechanism or something. Something that's sort of an afterthought. What the general said yesterday about providing the best technology, yesterday's technology to today. There's truth to that, and that's sort of the nexus of why the Ukrainians sort of have an aversion towards a lot of American technology companies. It's not that they're bad technology, it's just that they're not responsive. Whenever you're talking about proximity to the battlefield and the innovation cycle inside of Ukraine, if a defense contractor provides a drone to Ukraine and it performs badly, they provide feedback to the technology company, and then 6 months later they get something else, and it doesn't work again. It doesn't take long for them to say, we're just going to write those people off. I can take that technology, I can reproduce it or something similar to it, something that performs roughly the same function, and I can get it fielded within days or weeks. It doesn't take long to be sidelined. The companies that have done well, I think General Petraeus mentioned this yesterday as well, the companies that have done well have put permanent people inside of Ukraine to liaise with the Ukrainians, to hasten that feedback loop, and to represent the equities of the people that are using that technology on a regular basis.
A very brief follow-up on this. We've both gone to front lines and met with frontline units. Could you describe the feedback loop, including the battlefield labs that many of these units have, and the feedback loop between the units and the different elements of Ukraine's defense industrial base, both in the private sector and the government? Sure.
So the feedback loop is immediate. So let's say, when you think about the old model of like field service representatives or something like that, those are the same exact engineers in Ukraine that are building the technology, that know the technology intimately. They're co-located with the units. They're invested in what's going on, not just by the virtue of the fact that they're all Ukrainian and they're fighting for their homeland, but they're there with the units that are using the technology. So if something doesn't perform as advertised, then it's that feedback goes directly to the people that are making modifications to the technology. Everybody in the cycle is involved. The entire chain of command, everybody that's in the use chain of that technology is involved, and there's some impetus behind getting the improvements made. And you sort of have this comprehensive, holistic effort to make better technology. They have a deep understanding of what the Russians, just like the general just said, the Russians are innovating as well, right? So they have a deep understanding of what the Russians are doing to counter their own technology, and they're innovating. They're thinking about, what can we do, what parts can we do to overcome this innovation, what Russians have done to make our technology slightly better so that we can get a very short-term tactical advantage and then continue to innovate. It's that innovative spirit that has sort of steeped everyone throughout the entire chain.
Yeah,
and it's not just in the software and the hardware of these weapon systems. It's innovation in all kinds of other ways as well, as you know. So there's the Delta system, which is sort of the software platform that all the people in their Department of Defense use. Through that, you get access to lots of other capabilities, and one of those is there's an Amazon-like catalog of weapon systems, components, pieces, parts, everything else. There's 100 pages of, 8 to 10 products per page. You can actually click on it. You can order it from your unit, and they actually deliver it to you within a few days, actually on the front line, so that those who are out there tinkering with stuff can actually make modifications. Again, it's truly extraordinary. By the way, there's incentivization. If your unit does really well, there's competition between the unmanned systems, the aerial systems, for example. And it's on a phone. You can look and see how you stack up, how many points you got. And they tweaked the point system. It used to be that tanks were the most points because those were the big threats on the battlefield. They're no longer such a threat. So now, of all things, it can be individual soldiers. Self-propelled howitzers are more than towed howitzers and so forth. And those points can actually be redeemed, again, in a marketplace so that you can get more stuff for your particular organization. So the innovation, even in how all of this comes together, on top of the partnership between design, manufacturing, and employment, is really remarkable as well. And then I mentioned yesterday also this battle management system that they have accessible through Delta, which has hundreds of thousands of users now, is shortening that sensor to shooter timeline way down. It's incredible what they're doing. And again, it compares very, very favorably. It's much better, frankly, than what it is that we have that has cost billions of dollars in the U.S. And by the way, the real reason that many of the U.S. systems aren't welcomed anymore, they were in the beginning. Some of these are exquisitely capable. They just don't work anymore. And they aren't, again, improving them rapidly enough unless you actually have people out on the front lines who are working directly with those who are employing whatever it is that we are providing. So there's a huge distinction between the companies that do that and the companies where it has to come all the way back through the U.S. system because it's something procured either from the U.S. or given by the U.S., and those, again, just aren't responsive the way that the others are.
Yeah, and I think it's worth highlighting that many Ukrainian units have battlefield labs on the front line. So armed forces took on a function of the defense industrial base, but they were able to do so in part because before the war, Ukraine has had a very strong science and technology education, and a lot of technologists then put on uniforms after 2022. And if you look at the units that we visit, such as Nemesis, 50% of that unit actually came from the technology world. As we think about the requirements for US STEM education in this problem set. General Cleveland, we were discussing General McChrystal's Team of Team books the other day, and it was written a decade ago, but resonated deeply in this context as we were discussing innovation and adaptation. And in the very beginning, he references the Greek myth describing the battle between the Greeks and the shape-shifting god as a metaphor for innovation and adaptation. And he writes, and I will quote, that every time that this god has shape-shifted, the Greeks have shifted, and with each new challenge, they changed. And by adapting, the Greeks found their way home. And he compares his Joint Special Operations Task Force struggle against Al-Qaeda in Iraq to Greeks' challenge and concludes that adaptability must become our central competence. You worked in JSOC among many other elite organizations in your distinguished career. Is adaptability our central competence, and how to maintain it if it's not?
Yeah, thank you. In fact, first off, I would say after following General Hayden and General Nakasone and General Petraeus and Joey, I'm having that Wayne's World moment of I'm not worthy type of thing. So please bear with me as we have the discussion on that. First off, I would tell you, I think there are, and for everybody, I'll probably limit my discussion to the military, although I certainly want to acknowledge that the intelligence community, whether it's the CIA or NSA or NGA or many others, they've done significant innovation in a number of very difficult circumstances, but I'll probably focus primarily on the military. I think there are specific units, and I think there are specific leaders who view adaptability as really the hallmark of the organization and the ethos of the organization, but I think as a broader system, the system is not really set up for adaptability. It's a very conservative, a very risk-averse system. There are a number of checks and balances and a number of people that are involved in the procurement and the development of innovation. So I think fundamentally the system left to its own devices is going to not be favored towards adaptability. I think at the end of the day, it does take some very strong leaders to essentially be directive and be very hands-on and be engaged with that. When I think back to that time that General McChrystal is referring to, and of course General Petraeus was right in the middle of that as well, right before and during the surge in Iraq, and then subsequently in Afghanistan and Pakistan. A couple of key points jump out at me because I see these key points being used today at U.S. Central Command, the 18th Airborne Corps, a variety of places where there is adaptability, where there is real innovation happening on the U.S. military side. But I guess first and foremost is, and I think we all recognize this, but just to put it on the table, fundamentally, innovation on the battlefield is not just about a piece of tech and a piece of kit. In some ways, that's almost the easiest point, is getting that piece of kit out there. The real challenge becomes making sure that piece of tech absolutely can solve the problem that it's supposed to be doing. And then number two, that it can be integrated into a much broader system so that it's not operating in isolation and that it's integrated. The second aspect of it is one of the things that we did at that task force, as well as I do see happening in several organizations within the military today, is kind of, I would refer to it as a 60% rule. Not waiting for a finished product, not waiting for something that is complete, but fundamentally taking something where it's only a 50 or 60% solution and starting to use it and iterate with those who are going to need it. And starting off with the knowledge of here's what this piece of equipment can do, but almost as important, here's what it can't do right now, and here's the direction we think it's going, and being able to get that in the hands of, in this case, soldiers to be able to drive it. The next piece of it is, I think sometimes we can lose sight of the fact that all of these efforts have to be outcome-oriented. As you go through a procurement process, sometimes you can get focused on, well, the box has to have a green light here, and it has to be submersible down to 50 feet, and it has to weigh 3 pounds, and you lose the forest for the trees. And I think one of the things we saw in that task force is a bit of a focus on what is the outcome that we are ultimately trying to achieve with all of that. And so fundamentally, when I think about where do we see innovation today, there absolutely are units within the military that are following that ethos, that have leaders that are very hands-on, very engaged, very directive. But I don't think the system as a whole is really geared to do that.
Thank you. Alec, you have ushered the armed predator drone program in the US with no blueprint, no reference point, overcoming a lot of obstacles. In essence, having done what we're discussing that needs to be done today. Could you reflect on that experience from years ago and what lessons are relevant for today? And could you do the same thing in the current context?
Yeah, thank you, Nataliya. Thank you for the invitation to speak on the panel, and thanks for Cipher Brief for the opportunity as well. It's a fantastic collection, first time here. But definitely be back next year. To the point, and just for brief context, and I went to CIA as an Army warrant officer and became a case officer. And in the early days of CTC, pre 9/11, the opportunity to work with the Pentagon again came up on the challenge to do more, do better in Afghanistan against bin Laden. This was in 2000. So the reference to Predator was really driven out of something that I would have characterized at that point as a requirement, but really it was a mission statement or a problem statement of, we don't have a footprint in Afghanistan, again, before 9/11, and we don't have a robust technical capability at CIA, with the primary function being on the human intelligence side. So put your capabilities from CIA, from an authority's perspective, together with DOD's deeper pockets and technology, and come up with a capability. So we were given the problem statement of go to Afghanistan, find bin Laden, put U.S. eyes on target in an actionable sense, and do so within 9 months. That's the short version. I did write a book about it, and in the interest of time, I don't make much money off of it, but it's a decent read. But if given that problem statement, and again given a current problem statement, the innovation that exists within our ecosystem is significant enough to be able to take that and not be told it's got to be a widget with this capability, the green light, so forth. But let the system, and in this case, it's both military, it's intelligence, it's government, but it's also industry. Let the system evolve that capability for you. And I think to the point of could we do that again? The innovation is certainly there. The want on the part of everybody, both inside and outside of government, is there. That I think, yes, you can, but I think you have to, the system is not necessarily enabled to be able to do that. The procurement process that we've talked about, the acquisition system, the development system, the speed of innovation that Joey's talking about, these are the types of things that we're not set up particularly well to do. And I would say that one of the things that we've changed of administration, government shutdown, whenever we change administration, there's this disruption, this speed bump to progress. And in some cases, and I certainly exploited this back in 2000, there's some chaos, there's some gray zone to operate in. And I definitely did that with some of your predecessors to work in that gray zone, both within both the CIA and the Pentagon architecture. So what the current administration is doing and my current job is supporting, advising the Office of the Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering, where we're looking at these emerging technologies. And certainly the capability is there within the department to change. There's definitely the want to kind of change the acquisition process and enable industry to move faster and do better. And part of that is moving away from the requirements system. And you've probably read about it over the last probably 4 to 6 weeks. There's been a couple of deliberate changes to step away from JSONs, step away from defining requirements, and instead define or provide a problem. We've had this tradition of, we're going to tell industry what we want, and that solicitation is going to go out with these, massive specifications for what that end product needs to be. In reality, I support this. We need to go to industry and say, here's our problem. And these problems are broadly defined. One of them is multi-domain collaborative autonomy. We know we need to be able to operate in multiple domains. We know we need to be able to talk from subsurface autonomous submarines up through the stratosphere and everything in between, and then subsequently to space. Industry, how are we going to do that? How do we do that in a denied comms environment? How do we do that in a contested environment? How do we do that in Ukraine, which is dramatically different from how we would do that in the Straits of Taiwan? So give those problem statements, they're termed as key operational problems or joint operational problems, give those to industry and let industry come back and tell the department what they can do. So the speed of innovation can then start to adapt and provide those capabilities to ultimately to the warfighter. And to General Cleveland's comment, the 60% solution, it's encouraging to hear that from your perspective, because there is this apprehension within the department of we can't put something less than perfect into the field. We talked about JIDO a little bit yesterday. JIDO was an organization born out of necessity to solve the IED problem. And we put a lot of capabilities that, if we could get to 60%, that was a good capability. There was a lot of really need it bad, get it bad types of capabilities there. But if the department and if the services are able to accept something at a lower technology readiness level, then industry is certainly well positioned to do that. So the shorter answer is yes, I think that innovation capability is there, and the lessons learned from the past can certainly inform that.
Let me build on that really quickly, because I think I mentioned yesterday that I went to Secretary Gates early on in the surge in Iraq and said, look, sir, if it won't kill someone, if it doesn't perform, just send it to us. Get it out here. This is the whole idea. We'll give you feedback right away on where the deficiencies are, what we need to have improved and so forth, and get into a much more rapid cycle of innovation. And that worked quite well for a number of pieces of hardware, software, et cetera. But that has to be built into the entire sort of procurement model from the beginning, so that you're not back into this requirements process where you have to go back and argue about that, put it out back and forth, and all the rest of that. So that would be a huge breakthrough. And if you can convince the current occupants of the Pentagon to do more of that, that would be fantastic. And then, ultimately, though, the best test range in the world right now is in Ukraine. And in my view, if folks are not in there with what it is they're making, they're missing a huge opportunity to see how their stuff does. And that should be the place where we send it in again and experiment with it and play with it. Because the way they're doing that is just so remarkably quick, as Joey highlighted. I mentioned yesterday as well, I think that, they wanted to show me how the maritime drone works, from literally launching it out of a little fishing boat, getting it on the water, and what they've done, and they're already working on Mod 2 and Mod 3, bigger, better, et cetera. That's the kind of approach that we need to take in a much more aggressive manner, and noting that you're exactly right, that the theater of, again, that would be in the Taiwan Strait, and what is the range and duration and all where do you launch the stuff from, et cetera, those are very, very different problems from what is being done in Ukraine, and we just have to be keenly aware of that, and I think people are. But addressing this need for speed is really what a lot of this is about.
Yeah, General Petraeus, I have another question on the term advantage that have been mentioned a lot in the last 2 days. We know that innovation does not equal advantage automatically, and scale doesn't equal advantage automatically. Ukraine is producing 3.5 million FPV drones alone, with capacity to produce 4.5 million drones, and it's not dissimilar on the Russian side. But the challenge increasingly is on the battlefield is how do you integrate all of the capabilities into one coherent system that inflicts lasting damage on the adversary in time and space that matters. So how do we make sure that US innovating for advantage?
Well, now you're talking about battlefield management, if you will. And this is where this ISTAR system comes in, that again, this brilliant technologist, Isaac Flanagan, who is, it sold his third company or something like that, and was basically hanging out in Aspen skiing when the Russians did the invasion of February 2022, and decided to get out there and see what he could contribute. And several years later, it's arguably the best battlefield management and intelligence common operating picture system in the world. This pace of what it does and some of the diabolically clever ways that they have of actually identifying individuals on the other side and all the rest of this. The innovation there is, again, amazing. What has really done this is just really high-quality software engineers who understand the problems that they're trying to solve. So they're not sitting back at some plant somewhere. They're actually, again, out on the front lines with the actual users, making tweaks to it constantly. And then there are hundreds of others that are actually feeding the information into it and trying to automate the process for that as well. But again, the ultimate impact of this is why, again, Russian traditional combined arms warfare no longer works. The moment that something appears, they keep trying it, by the way. They've done it again more recently, and the entire offensive unit is wiped out. And again, we're talking about tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, engineers, and all those that would accompany that lead echelon. There is a gap right now, and this is something that they're working very hard on. There's a limit to the range and duration of these first-person view suicide drones. And so it can engage up to about 20 kilometers from the front lines, depending on where it's launched. Behind friendly lines, the further you can get it, the more vulnerable you find the stuff that's there. But there's an area that is not under threat the way that it should be. It's sort of the mid-range. There's even more strategic stuff, but that mid-range so far is the area that they've got to extend the capabilities. And so they're doing innovation here. They have motherships that fly up as far as they can and then launch the first-person view drones, and they can get further back at that kind of thing. These are the kinds of problems that they're working on right now, but this battle management system is extraordinary. And if we can ever get this and many of the other technologies that are being developed there, so that, again, for the companies here that are trying to figure out how do I actually get access to this, invest it. I mentioned yesterday the joint ventures that are now going on. I think we're going to see a proliferation of those in Europe first, because they recognize that they're way behind the power curve, and so they're picking out individual companies and then having them establish a joint venture in their company, in their country, so that they can get access to this kind of technology, the concepts, et cetera. At some point, I think iStars is going to get out as well, and we'll see the impact of that in the West also.
Yeah. John Clinton, very briefly, on the same point, systems like Palantir, of course, and capabilities like Palantir are a big part of ensuring that all capabilities are integrated for effect. How are you thinking about the adaptation and transformation that Palantir has to go through and that overall ecosystem, given the emerging context in Ukraine?
And real quickly, they're a success, by the way. And the reason they're a success, I think, is because your people are out with the units the way that iStar is and integrating with iStar, et cetera.
Yes, sir. In fact, I think that's exactly the answer. Is fundamentally, we've all talked about it, but I think the most important thing is having a presence out there with the actual users and on the ground. And whether, again, it was 15, 20 years or so ago in Iraq, or whether it's today in Ukraine, or whether it's even on training ranges, fundamentally the idea of embedding your personnel, your company's personnel, with the user to, number one, make sure that everybody has a common understanding of the problem. Number two, has a common understanding of the situation and the surrounding conditions that you're in. Number three, has a common understanding of what that commander's intent is at a moment. And then that allows for the decentralized execution. So once you've got your people on the ground, they understand the problem and they also help own the problem and then own the solution. That allows for that decentralized execution. And so I think the successes that I have seen have by and large been based on that very embedded approach of having engineers sitting directly with users and operators and being there over time so that they are a part of the problem and that they are a part of really the solution in being able to move forward.
You know, the genius of Palantir back in the Iraq days was that they got into the units during the road to deployment, unlike any others. And so they actually offered their systems to units as they're actually preparing for the mission rehearsal exercise and so forth, all the prep for that. They're actually using it at the National Training Center, and then the unit takes it with them. And of course, the Army was almost oblivious to all of this and kept trying to choke it off because it required so much bandwidth. But that was, again, real genius in what they did. They're doing the same thing in Ukraine. But there are relatively few companies that are doing that. And again, it's even less so, I think, when it comes to hardware. There are relatively few companies making hardware weapon systems that are wildly successful on the battlefield because they just can't innovate at the speed that the Ukrainian systems can. By the way, we should also not lose sight of the fact that the Ukrainian systems cost a fraction of what U.S.-produced systems cost. And again, they're actually even better than what it is that we're providing to them. Again, the initial stuff we provided, which was so exquisitely capable, was a breakthrough until it wasn't. And that happened a long time back.
Sir, and if we're being transparent, the Army was also trying to choke off Palantir because they had this giant multi-billion-dollar program of record that was that they'd paid a contract on, and it didn't work. We used to baseline all the computers and use them for the computers that they provided. And so the Army, in the Army's logic, again the procurement system, the Army had paid I don't how many $1 billion for this program of record that nobody liked, and it didn't communicate between systems. And so why use Palantir? Why spend more money on those licenses?
Well, the problem there was that the Army thought that we could make a better system than could the best and brightest out in Silicon Valley. Right. And that should have been obvious to us is not going to be possible. Right. We don't have the best and brightest in all cases across the board, like Palantir assembled, again, in various locations. And we spent billions of dollars trying to prove that the Army could do that until finally, I think Palantir took them to court, and eventually that system was written off and a Palantir system actually was brought in.
And Nataliya, I think that speaks to the future of the public-private partnership aspect, and that fundamentally, we touched on it yesterday, that certainly the U.S. military, and I think the broader government, is not going to be as successful as it should be unless we can collectively embrace this idea of taking the best out of the private space and getting it integrated into the public space. And I think as I think about where we are today, I think everybody recognizes it, and now the hard part becomes the actual implementation. I know in my previous jobs, as I would engage with third-party vendors and contractors, quite honestly, before that engagement, I would have this entire room full of lawyers, and I would have acquisition and contract specialists and our engagement industry team, and every single one of them would be telling you can't say this, you can't talk about that, you can't engage on the following things, or you're going to commit the government, et cetera. So you kind of get to a point where you think, this is more trouble than it's worth, and there's just too much risk. And now, as I kind of grew through that and saw that quite honestly, and as I reach back into, former colleagues and do some mentoring, I try and encourage them that, hey, fundamentally today, there's risk in everything you do, but frankly, there's a lot more risk in not engaging with the private sector, in not having those discussions, in not getting comfortable and familiar with those colleagues, because the real risk comes to your formation and your team that you're responsible for trying to drive forward if you're not able to bring in industry and make them a part of that broader tapestry that you find out on the battlefield.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to leave a couple of minutes for questions, but I have one more question for the panel, and perhaps, Alec, you could start. how do we make sure that the signal that is sent to the United States defense industrial base is driven by the foresight about what the adversary is actually doing and where they're headed? And to give an example from Ukraine right now, we talked about Shahed drones. Ukraine is now intercepting Shahed drones with unmanned systems. That was not always the case. Early in the war, Russia have been producing Shaheds in Tatarstan with Iran's help at a relatively modest pace, and Ukraine was using different capabilities like mobile fire teams, for example, to take down Shaheds. However, with the help of China, Russia was able to scale the production of Shaheds and now is working on the jet-powered version of it. So Ukraine had to innovate and develop unmanned systems to intercept Shahed drones. But right now, the pace of Ukrainian innovation is behind, at this point, the pace of Russia's ability to scale the production of those drones. So how do we make sure that what we build next is the right thing and is driven by actually threat, not just broader requirements? So it's a question about intelligence and innovation. And Alec, perhaps you could start. And I do want to leave a few minutes for the questions.
Yeah, just very briefly, I don't think the Department of War has done a particularly good job of messaging that yet. I do think that it's foundational it's an intelligence problem that then has to be articulated in what I was talking about earlier, getting these key operational problems defined. How do we counter with low-cost solutions, the short-range air defense, as an example? I do think that the department needs to do a better job of messaging that there is that one CTO, currently Emil Michael is Undersecretary for R&E. There is one CTO, and despite the many, many ways for entry and contracts to move, DIU and AppFit and others, there's not a coherent message that's come out yet. But as you look at the short-range air defense problem, I do think that that the opportunity is there to now solicit against those problem sets and then enable with some seed money to the capabilities to try and evolve more quickly and avoid the famous valley of death for acquisition systems.
Additionally, of course, you got to think about not just how do you, on a nightly basis, defend against this stuff. It's also about the other elements of the overarching strategy we should be pursuing, which is to crush the Russian war economy with additional EU sanctions, additional U.S. sanctions, other Western sanctions, and penalize, punish those who actually enable it. Because what is enabling it right now is those who are purchasing the oil and gas and those who are providing the components to that military-industrial complex in Russia that enable them to produce more and better and higher flying and faster Shaheds that make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to shoot it down. So, as always, there has to be a comprehensive approach to this, even as you're focusing on what do you do tonight, again, to shoot these down.
Thank you. We talked a lot about our innovation and our partners, less so about the adversary. I'm going to pull a Suzanne here and cold call. Is Ralph Goff here? Ralph, do you want to share just briefly thoughts on what our adversaries beyond Russia are learning, and is their pace of learning outpaces ours?
So, our adversaries are there, right? China's watching, Iran is deeply involved, right? North Korea is there, right? You look at the lineup of our foes, and they're all there, and they're taking these lessons home. I mean, there's a reason other than making quick money why, the North Korean leader sent 12,000 of his men to die somewhere in Russia, right? They were learning, the survivors are going back with lessons, right? They've learned a lot of stuff on the battlefield there. They've learned a lot about tech. Now you see new North Korean weapon systems being brought in by the Russians. They're using those. They're field testing those. And look, you've got North Korean forces are facing U.S. forces and South Korean allies on the Korean Peninsula. The entire military dynamic there can change in the next couple of years from what these people learn inside Ukraine. So our adversaries, they're not skipping school here. They're paying attention. And the general also brought up a good point about the joint ventures, right? We see these joint ventures in Europe. I know there's German companies that are working with Ukrainian companies. I know there are some American companies that are starting to do that, but we need more. I mean, the U.S. should be in the lead there. And finally, I would say one thing that the Ukrainians' next challenge is exporting, right? Taking these, what they're developing there, they're slowly, but surely at least now, removing the barriers to export. And recently there was a presidential decree there where they said they're going to lift export barriers to things like proven combat drones, naval drones, huge market, particularly for naval drones right now, right? Because that's a real equalizer on the seas. Drone communications and control systems, particularly systems that work in robust EW environments. And finally, ground-based robots that are used there for assault, for defense. They use them for CASEVAC, they use them for logistics. I mean, there was an attack a few months ago we heard about from some of our Ukrainian colleagues where they launched an entire robotic attack. There were drones from the sky, there were ground drones on the ground with machine guns on them, there were ground drones going behind the lines to sow remote mines, right? All these lessons that are out there, I think we're pretty slow on the uptake, and our adversaries, meanwhile, they're paying attention, they're taking notes, and they're learning.
Thank you, Ralph. I see flashing red lights, and I know we have an important guest calling in from Ukraine, from the front lines. I'm sure we will continue this discussion in the audience, and I just want to really thank for the panelists for a fantastic conversation, and thanks Suzanne and Brett for the opportunity.